Alrighty, well, I said I was going to do one, so here it is. I feel like it's kind of worth doing this after the couple buffs Warriors have received, kind of talking about Thane versus Slayer again, and kind of how I feel about them per dungeon. Um, but let's go over the dungeons I personally feel... it's so hard to talk about. It's so hard to talk about because the main problem that Slayer actually has, like right now, damage-wise, they're decently close, you know. I think Thane definitely has the edge in like sustained cleave, as well as larger target packs. Just because Thunderclap is reduced beyond 5, excuse me, is reduced beyond 5 instead of hard capped at 5, which is most of Slayer's damage. But one of the things that Thane really does have over Slayer is it actually has defensive value. And that makes it way more important. More so than anything else. Because when you go into higher and higher keys, that additional defensive value is going to make a large difference. So instead of talking about high keys and everything, I want to talk about what most people see as the goal is 10s, right? 10s are going to be the goal. What would I recommend to run for 10s? What do I think is best for each? And then I'll talk about high keys later, because that's a bit more of... there's a bit more nuance there, but it's more of a... But a lot of players don't really go there. So we'll go dungeon by dungeon, and we'll talk about it. First things first, City of Threads. Now, personally, especially in a pug, City of Threads to me is a Slayer dungeon. And it's a Slayer dungeon for one reason only, and it's this talent right here, actually. A lot of difficulty I've ever had in this dungeon has been with pugs on the second boss, because it simply does a lot of damage. But this talent removes all movement impairing effects, and it can occur every 30 seconds. And the boss, interestingly enough, most of its damage, like its big... Where's my MDT, man? There it is. Most of the second boss's big damage is actually tied to the icicles, because it puts a massive dot on you, deals damage 12 times over 12 seconds, but it has a movement speed impairing effect and reduce movement speed by 30%. So you can actually use this talent to get rid of that massive dot, and it actually saves you a lot of damage. It saves you a lot of health. As far as pugging is concerned, I definitely prefer having that on this boss, just because it makes life a little easier. Something else that is kind of fun about this boss is that, or about this dungeon, is that the third boss, the Coagulation, has 0 armor. So warriors, ferals, classes that are specifically physical damage do a ton of damage to this boss, making warrior actually pretty good for this dungeon. You can also, like I said in the previous tips video, you can spell Reflect Shadows of Doubt, making this way easier for your party. But why specifically do I prefer Slayer? And it's simply because, outside of a lot of packs, with most of these packs here, you'll notice a lot of them just have a bunch of little baby shitter mobs. In the packs you might pull, there's 2 to 3. This is probably the biggest pack you're going to be really pulling together, if you even pull these first 2. But the fact of the matter is, all of these little baby ads die very quickly, and then you're left with about 4 mobs. And when you're fighting 4 to 5 mobs, you're still within the overall damage value of Slayer's range. Mainly because Thane does do better on Sustain Cleave, like I said, but when you're doing these 10s, a lot of people have gear, the mobs aren't going to have that much health. And realistically, you're going to be blowing up them and the little baby ads quite quickly. So that Sustain Cleave isn't really going to make that much of a difference. It's going to help you with the Ice Sage on the second boss. And the other reason why I like Slayer is because of how it has shorter AoE cooldowns, because of the amount of reduction you're getting through Blade Storm, and just generally, you don't have reduction through Odin's Fury, but you're going to have it more often. That actually does play a decent part into the last boss, considering that if you do not kill the Umbra Weaves, or you do not have a lot of people that can just immune them, you're going to be able to blow these up every single time on every rotation quite quickly, getting your team out of the Weaves and allowing you to move before the next shifting anomalies slam on top of your group. But otherwise, it's basically the fact that there's not a lot of very chunky mobs here. You have your little small packs that you pull, but it's a bunch of baby ads. So the additional bonus of playing Thane, which is higher sustain cleave with higher target counts because of how Thunderclap scales and how it does damage reduced beyond 5 targets rather than doing only damage to 5 targets. It basically means that you're never really going to be dealing with, I don't know why I did that, but you're never really going to be dealing with the situation where you're sustain cleaving on a lot of chonky, healthy targets. You might do a little bit of that in this area, but a single area to me is simply not worth the additional value you're going to be getting for the last boss for killing the roots and stuff, for this boss for being able to self-remove the root. In higher coordinated groups in this dungeon, Shaman, once again, Shaman coming in with the ability to do whatever it wants. Shaman actually has a follow-up talent to its totems, which is, here, let me bring it up real quick. We'll go to Wowhead. What's that picture? Chromie, Jesus. But if you go into the Shaman tree, and this is all Shamans, by the way. This isn't just, like, Resto Shaman, because it's in the base talent tree. It's this talent here, right below Windrush Totem, and it's called Jet Stream. Windrush Totem's movement speed bonus is increased by 10% and now removes snares. This also works on the icicles, which is going to be a lot of the damage you take in this fight. So if you have a Shaman and they're running that, that's when I'm looking at. If you're in a more coordinated group, that's when I would maybe think Thane is probably going to perform better for you overall here. But realistically, in Pugs, people aren't taking this. They might not use it correctly. So I would 100% recommend playing Slayer in this dungeon. And the next dungeon I also think is also Slayer, and that is Ara-kara. The main reason, once again, is that there's a bunch of little baby ads that you're fighting. There are a lot of these crawlers that you can kill, so there is a high amount of sustained cleave you can do in this dungeon. But what I like about Slayer more so than anything else is especially the first boss, because Slayer, like in the Raid or Queen Anserek, has a lot of burst AoE, right? It's just big burst AoE. So on the first boss, when it's summoning all the little baby ads, you're just going to be able to blow those up. You go over there, you Odin's Fury into Blade Storm, and you just blow those things up. And then the other set, you can use cooldowns. One set, you use Odin's Fury Blade Storm. The next set, you use cooldowns. But it basically makes it way easier for your group. You make sure that those ads are dead. You're able to... You have enough talent points, especially when playing Slayer, that you can take Shockwave. That's going to be really nice. So you can Shockwave all the ads and blow them up before they really move anywhere. I really like the burst AoE of Slayer here. Once again, like I said, in higher keys it matters more, but in lower keys things die so quickly, like the 10 range, that you don't really need the sustained burst from Thane, and the availability of more frequent burst AoE is probably going to provide a better value for you overall. And most of the value is honestly coming from just making sure this first boss goes well. If the rest of your group doesn't have to get off the boss, they can just focus on hitting the boss, getting it down, and you can focus on blowing the ads up. You're doing your job, you're using your burst AoE, and I really do like Slayer for this dungeon. You also don't really do... There's not, like, a lot of trash to do, you know? Like, there's a lot here, but a lot of them are little baby ads. There's crawlers that kill themselves at, like, as well as, like, 25% health. They blow up and kill themselves. So, like, realistically, there's not a ton of extra value that Thane is getting here. Thane will get a little more value from like execute damage based on vicious contempt. But this is another dungeon where I think Slayer just kind of shines. You also have more frequent AoE for this boss. So you can just also blow up the ads. It seems kind of lame and it sounds kind of lame that you're the ad killer guy. But realistically, there aren't other classes that can do what we do without losing a significant amount of resources towards that their single target damage that should be going into a boss or should be going into a priority target instead. So that allows us to do our job, which is do the big boom AoE, while they can actually step forward and do a lot of the more single target damage. And our single target damage still is nothing to snuff at. even though we're doing burst AoE, even though we're prioritizing ads, we still do a lot of single target because our single target's actually pretty decent in our AoE spec. So do not sleep on that. However, now is when I'm feeling like we are basically moving away from Slayer, and the rest of the dungeons pretty much feel more Thane to me, and I'll explain why. You've heard me talk a lot about the fact that the little baby ads just kind of blow up and don't matter, but then you get to dungeons like Grim Betold. You get to in these other dungeons where you're not fighting little baby ads. You're fighting packs of mobs, dragons, packs of mobs. You're not really fighting any of these. You have little baby ads here, but that's such an insignificant amount of the dungeon. But the amount of sustain cleave that you can actually do through Thane is actually going to be very, very valuable. And the other reason why Thane is super valuable is this talent here. One of the things that happened with our switch up with our talent tree is the fact that we lose endurance training. I think the last time I simmed, the difference between wild strikes and endurance training was roughly, it's like 35, maybe 40k at this point. So it is possible that you can do something like this instead and get way more health. But realistically, one thing that's very nice about Thane is we already have this talent here, which is your stamina is increased by 5%. Now, the whole description of the talent is kind of weird, but this talent is way better than you think it is, especially when you're dealing with any kind of AoE damage, when you're dealing with stuff like the Lava Benders or Big Burst AoE, that kind of thing. This buff has roughly, when I did checks, like 47 to like 53-ish % uptime when I was just looking at like my random logs of doing dungeons. And that's good. Like you say, oh, you have 50% reduction for 8 seconds. That's great. But it's not as good as you think. Because you're never, unless you're holding Thunder Blast, which you don't want to do, you're not really going to have that damage reduction all the time. You're not going to have the damage reduction when you want it, right? And the physical damage reduction taken doesn't really affect anything. Most AoEs and most damage you're going to be taking casters. There's not really a lot of like crossbow type enemies in these dungeons. It's mainly a lot of magic damage that you're dealing with. So the physical damage reduction doesn't really do anything for us. And also, they changed it. It used to be armor is not affected by armor to the teeth. So realistically, Steadfast has the peaks while you go, well, it's 8% versus 5%. Well, that 5% is all the time. All the time you have 5% max health. And on top of having that 5% max health, you can use Impending Victory basically whenever you want because the cooldown is so short, and you have 15% increased max health. Right now, when I use this, I go from 7.2 just below 8 million health as a DPS. And if I wanted to, I could even spec over here for more health. I could probably be at like 8.4 or maybe like 8.3, 8.4 million health in dungeons. I would be omega safe compared to every other DPS in the game. On top of, if you use it preemptively, you're going to heal all of that extra 10% max health back after you've taken a big hit. So this thing realistically is 15% value in terms of living things. While this, it is 8%, but it's also not 8% when you want it. It's just kind of 8% when it happens. So the real value, this talent is crazy, crazy good. And I would highly recommend running Steadfast at the Peaks over Keep Your Feet on the Ground. This is definitely more of a tank talent. Mainly because, yeah, tanks can benefit from the 5%, but the 2% on top of the 8%, and I think Prot doesn't necessarily get more Thunder Blast, but it certainly feels like you have the buff up more often. So this feels more suited towards Prot than DPS. But this is one of the reasons why that Thane is so good in higher keys, is simply because you have way more defensive value with Steadfast as the peaks. You have way more sustained AoE damage because mobs live longer. And you do have execute damage. execute slash prio damage through Vicious Contempt and Ravager, compared to the raw AoE that is Blade Storm and Odin's Fury. This build specifically picks up 1 point in Odin's Fury, mainly because, realistically, you could put 2 points in Vicious Contempt, but I do like having a bit of extra overall damage. And since we have a point in Bloodborne anyway to enable Cold Steel Hot Blood even more, just having an extra point in that bleed, and this being the bleed being buffed by another, 20% on top of the fact that we're already running Thunderous Roar anyway, because I don't like running Spear at all. I really like this build. You kind of just send Odin's Fury whenever. Realistically, you just kind of send Odin's Fury towards the end of your Recklessness window, so you get that additional crit chance for the application and the hit. Otherwise, I definitely think that you can just run this build for more priority damage if you want, but I do like the overall of having Odin's Fury in there. Also, it helps the fact that we have Titan's Torment, so anytime we Avatar, we just get another cast of Odin's Fury. It just does a decent amount of AoE damage. It did get capped. Same thing with the Roar, it did get capped. Like, if we look back at this key I did earlier, this 14 Dawnbreaker, like, our Roar and our Odin's Fury aren't doing, like, that great, but 6.5% damage from a single talent point compared to just buffing a bit of priority is pretty good in overall for keys. And while overall is kind of a meme, at the same time, you do want to do as much damage as possible, right? You do want to do as much damage as possible. But that's why I think Thane is definitely better for Grim Batol. Just because you're fighting these chonky mobs, you can have that extra health whenever you want to. The Lava Benders are dangerous. The Beguilers are dangerous. There's lots of casters. There's lots of curses. There's a lot of crap you have to deal with. And a lot of that, you can just protect yourself way more through Thane. On top of the fact that you're just dealing more sustained cleave compared to burst AoE. Because a lot of these packs don't have like a lot of these little baby crappy mobs in them. You're dealing with actual mobs the whole time. And going into Dawnbreaker, it's kind of the same thing. It's kind of the same story. You could say, one thing that I have thought about is, because the last boss goes from 100% to 60%, you're not really gaining any value from the Vicious Contempt talent in this dungeon. So it is possible that in this dungeon specifically, maybe you look for something else, but realistically there's nothing else to kind of put it in. And you are getting value on everything else. But once again, just like Grim Batol, you're dealing with chonky mob packs, right? The first pull, all chonky real mobs, all real mobs, all real mobs. There's not a single pull in this dungeon that you do outside of this boss spawning animated shadows, and it spawns little globule guys. Outside of that, every single pull is a healthy, chonky mob that you are fighting and trying to kill as quickly as possible. So having that additional sustain cleave from Thane, I think, way outweighs it. Not to mention, this mini boss right here is actually one of the most dangerous in the entire dungeon because it overlaps the Abyssal Blast with its AoE damage. Thankfully for us, most Abyssal Blasts we can just reflect and then not necessarily have to worry about it. But once again, having that 5% health, and then during the burst window, the third cast of Dark Orb overlaps with Shadowy Decay, making it very, very dangerous. So once again, we can have that 15% extra max health for these burst windows that we're dealing with, on top of the little heal that comes after, on top of just being able to, just having that availability to live better, rather than just, if you don't have a, if you're not like holding a Thunder Blast proc for whatever reason, if you're running the other talent to get that 8% damage reduction, like, which feels bad, realistically, Steadfast is just going to be worth way, way more. And once again, like I said, you're just, every single mob in this dungeon is a real mob. It's not a little baby mob. You're not dealing with a bunch of crappy guys. That is why I think Thane is better, even though you're not getting any real XP value on the last boss. But realistically, it's honestly going to be the same for most of these. It is a bunch of real mobs, sustain, cleave, yada yada, you know the deal. Thane also has a bit of an extra value in this dungeon, mainly because of this boss. Thane's 2-target is really, really good through the use of Thunder Blast and Ground Current, and just having its 2-target cleave is actually way better. Its 2-target cleave is definitely better than Fury, or sorry, than Slayers for sure. So it actually, you do get a little added value onto this boss on top of having the additional damage from this. So it is quite nice to have, but once again, like I said, you're dealing with a bunch of chonky mobs. All of these guys are real mobs, have big health, and that's just going to be the story, right? That's going to be the story for all of them. I've harped on it. I've told you why they're better, and it is simply because real mobs, real mobs, real mobs, real mobs. There are some crappy mobs in there, like these powder shots are kind of crappy, but these mobs are real, right? Like the spotter's real. So the additional value that you're going to be getting out of Slayer or would be getting out of Slayer just isn't really going to mesh up in here. The other thing that is kind of niche about Thane is the fact that the Crackling Thunder movement speed reduction from Thunderclap does actually work on the third boss, so you can just keep this boss permanently snared. Most classes have a way to do this, so it's not something you're really going to like think about, but it is something that is kind of nice. And then, like I said, once again, it's going to be... There are more baby crappy mobs here. And there is a case that could be... You could say that the burst because Slayer does do better bursts than Thane, and that burst could be important for the third boss, but realistically, Thane can still get all of its like burst window out before the boss jumps back up, so it kind of negates the value that you're getting out of Slayer. And once again, like I said, it's chonky mobs. These guys are real mobs, but like the blight bags that are running around are kind of fake mobs, but still, most of the mobs that you're dealing with are real. They're chonky. This boss, the Heaving Wretch, does a crazy amount of damage. Like, this thing does more damage than you really expect. So, once again, just having that bit of extra health whenever you want it is really, really good. But it's the same for these other dungeons, right? Once again, even in the maze, every one of these packs are real. All of these packs are real mobs. There's a couple shitters here. Like, sorry, by shitter, I mean shit, like these little baby mobs that don't do anything. But that is mainly the main reason why I think the Ara-kara and City of Threads dungeons are kind of better for Slayer, for the utility / the fact that you're not really dealing with like large packs of real mobs. Because even in this area, right? Even in the main area that you're dealing with, you're going to be getting 4 mobs, right? The Queen and 4 mobs. So you're still not getting that value from Slayer. Or excuse me, from Thane. So overall, like I said, I think that City of Threads and Ara-kara have definitely, in terms of like pugging, the advantage of being Thane or Slayer keys. But when you go down into Grim Patrol, Dawn, all of these, just because of dungeon design, the fact that you're fighting real mobs all the time makes Slayer feel definitely better. I think you'll get way more value out of it, and it might take a bit of timing to get used to, or it might just be weird to get used to, but preemptively using Impending Victory is actually pretty dang good, all when you need to live big hits. So give it a try. Let me know what you think. But that's all I have for today. One thing I do want to just kind of yap about, though, is the fact that both of our hero talents are good in different situations. Like, Slayer's definitely a little better in Raid, but a lot of that has to deal with timings. And even in Raid, Mountain Thane definitely has a case for it in 2-target cleave on Silken Court. But I like the fact that Thane and Slayer are pretty good. Like, I think they're pretty close to each other. Thane definitely comes out when you start doing higher and higher keys, just because of its sustained cleave is just way better. But I like the fact that Slayer definitely has potential, depending on the dungeon pool, depending on what you need to do, depending on if there's anything you can do to cheese or snare or get rid of roots and snares and that kind of thing. Slayer could definitely find its place right alongside Thane in any kind of dungeon. It just kind of depends on the design. And the fact that they're so closely tuned together that you can basically do lower and higher keys as either one of them is really cool. It's really great. You're able to just kind of play what you want. And that's not something that has been uh, real for a long time, honestly. Normally, there's always something that's so much better that you play it, but they've, at least for us in Slayer and Thane, they've done a very good job at balancing them. And the only reason why Slayer really has an edge in Raid is just because it's got better timings, and because its burst AoE, it's padding. It's all bigger pad. And because it's big pad, it's just going to sim high. It's just going to have higher numbers on fights with a bunch of little baby ads like Brood Twister, Queen Ansurek, and Rashanam, where killing the little ads does matter, right? Like, it does matter. But the fact that it's just doing the damage in a smaller contained window, which is important, that's just kind of why Slayer fits in there. Yeah, anyway, I've kind of run out of stuff to talk about this. I just thought it was fun to kind of, basically, I was like, man, these two keys are great for Slayer, and then we talked about these. So yeah, okay, I'm gonna end the video now because I'm just kind of rambling because I felt like it. Alrighty, bye bye.